Good morning. Welcome to the 12th day of April 2018. This is Freeway Bible Study. My name is Kurt Bell. I'm your host. Today, Genesis 31. Jacob flees from Laban. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Laban, something like that. I'm a non-believer, yet I enjoy studying the Bible. And this project will take me all the way from Genesis through to the end of Revelation. At this point, we're still following the tale of Jacob. Make sure my bike's all ready to go. Gotta make sure it's all ready to go. Don't want anything flapping around or flying off as I go down the road. Okay, we're good. Let's go. Jacob has been staying, I think it's been 20 years in the land of his uncle, his mother's brother, Laban. He's married two of Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, in that order. He was deceived a little bit because he really just wanted Rachel, but he wound up getting a twofer. But he had to pay for both of them, 7 years of labor. An additional 6 years was spent to earn the cattle that he is now running away with. In the preceding chapters, we saw how there was kind of a deal made between Laban and Jacob, that Jacob would take the spotted, speckled, and striped cattle, and then God kind of, worked with Jacob with a strange form of almost like evolution, natural selection, a mechanism with the sticks to create striped, speckled, and spotted sheep. And anyway, he wound up increasing the herd in such a way that he got the lion's share, no pun intended, of the cattle. Laban was pretty upset about that, even though Laban had been treacherous in his efforts to prevent Jacob from getting his share. A lot of treachery, a lot of deceit going on in these stories. So at this point, Jacob has been enriched by these exploits, and namely by the hand of God, by the assistance of God. God's really tipped the scales in Jacob's favor, as God seems to do with everybody in Abraham's line. They really are his chosen people, and he has a covenant with each of them. Make them as numerous as the grains of sand in the sea and stars in the sky, and do whatever he can. God will do whatever he can to help them along the way. So at this point, though, things aren't good between the house of Jacob and the house of Laban. In particular now, this chapter 31 opens with Laban's sons have been kind of voicing their displeasure of Jacob. Openly saying things like, this Jacob's got all this wealth from our father. He's basically, everything that he has is by virtue of our family. And he looks, when Jacob knows that whenever Laban looks at him, he's kind of, giving him he's not looking at him with the loving eyes of a caring uncle, but more like one who feels he's been deceived. And things are getting a little hot around the collar. I picture Rodney Dangerfield kind of, grabbing his collar, pulling it back and saying, I get no respect. It may be even dangerous, right? Although I'm sure that, and we'll see this said in just a minute, that Jacob he knows that Laban knows that Jacob's God is powerful. And he's going to be cautious because he knows that Jacob's protected by his God. But nevertheless, Jacob decides it's time to go. And in fact, does God talk to him? I think so. I think God does talk to him. Excuse me a second. I think God does talk to him right there at the opening, maybe. If not, he decides one way or another that it's time to go, and he calls Leah and Rachel out to the fields. So maybe I'm picturing him, he's out there tending his flocks, and he sends maybe a boy back and says, get Leah and Rachel and have them come out to me. And they come out and they have a little talk. And Jacob basically says, look, here's the deal. I worked 7 years for each of you, and then an additional 6 years for the sheep. God was on my side all along. God basically, the deal I had with your dad was that, one of us would choose a particular type of sheep, either speckled, spotted, and striped, or clear, and whichever one wound up being in my favor, God would make that. Now, which isn't really true. That's not how it went down a few chapters back, right? I mean, basically, when that happened, Jacob selected the speckled, spotted, and striped. So it wasn't like Laban had a choice there. Although he could have chosen to say no, right? In any event, he's basically saying, Jacob's saying to his wives, the daughters of Laban, I worked really hard, I was honest, I was fair, I was upright. Your dad is the one that, has kind of screwed us. And things are hot between us now, and I think it's time we go. He didn't actually say that about the go part, but it's implied. And the women respond that, yeah, we kind of see what they're agreeing with him. And they're basically complaining that their dowry, they didn't get a dowry. They complained that they were actually sold, almost like sold to Jacob. Because the custom at the time, I researched this a little bit, was to provide a dowry. So the father's household would provide a bridal dowry, which would actually go into the household of her husband, but be the property of the wife. And the dowry was intended to be a security instrument, so that if the husband, something happened to the husband, so she wouldn't become poor, or if he kicked her out, she would have something to support herself. Basically, in a little bit of an insurance policy. And they complained to Jacob that neither of them really got a dowry. That basically Jacob had to work for them. And so what they're saying is that whatever you managed to get out of our dad, by virtue of the deal with the sheep, consider that our dowry. And we really don't. And what's more, they're kind of looking at it like Dad sold us, not Dad gave us to Jacob for marriage, but Dad sold us because he got 7 years labor out of Jacob for each of us. And they're kind of kicking their dad to the curb, maybe deservedly so, saying, he didn't treat us like daughters, he treated us more like possessions. They don't go so far as to indicate like slaves, but that's the sentiment. They're ready, and they conclude by saying, whatever it is your God is telling you to do right now, they're talking to Jacob, their husband, do it. And Jacob's God is, that's right, somewhere in here Jacob's God is saying, it's time for you guys to get up, get out, and head on back to your dad, back to Isaac's place. 20 years is probably enough. Esau has probably cooled down. Because remember, Jacob deceived him too. So that's what they do. And I guess they don't live right next to Laban, because they kind of pack. I mean, it's hard to pack up, all your sheep and cattle and all the men and slaves and women folk and kids and household goods and go. But they managed to do that, and it's 3 days later that word comes to Laban that they've left. So clearly they're not living very near one another if it took 3 days for word like that to get back to him. And he's very upset. Because, for one thing, because two things. One, because they left the way they did, and two, someone took the household gods. Now, I looked this up too, and it turns out that the household gods may not have been what they sound like. They may have been simply figures not gods actually, but figures representing deceased ancestors. So, I mean, like in my wife's family in Japan, they have photos of all the deceased, recently deceased, within 2 generations, up on the ceiling, up near the ceiling, along the ceiling, and we decorate those during Obon, or you provide some ceremony, kind of recognizing the ancestors who are thought to come back. It is something like that. So someone has stolen those statues, the little statues that Laban would have had, and being I guess he was the oldest and therefore the head of the family, these statues would have passed through the family line from eldest son to eldest son, and therefore the ancestor would be well maintained. And I can understand his concern, because I remember that my father-in-law, who was the eldest son, so to speak, he had a great concern that the proper ceremony and respect was applied to these photographs, and also to the Butsudan altar, which is an altar in Japan. It's an altar to the past dead ancestors. So basically it's very similar to what the Japanese ceremonies are very similar to what I'm reading about here in the Bible. So Laban is not at all happy about this, and also this, having stolen those statues is kind of like stealing his, that's a kind of an emblem of his being the head of that particular family. And then also, why are they taking that? Are they going to go off to another land where they worship maybe another god? We don't know if Laban actually worships the God of Jacob. He certainly knows of the God of Jacob. He's actually spoken. He actually speaks. He hears the voice of that God in this particular chapter, but we don't know if he actually worships and abides that particular God and has given up any other gods. Although so far there's no indication from God that there should be no other gods before me, or that you can't worship others. So who knows? So anyways, so he hears the news that Jacob and his family have left, and he further discovers that his statues have his little mini representations of the deities. They're called statues of the gods in the Bible, in one of them, I think maybe in the New International Version. And he's upset. So he gathers his men and he sets off in pursuit. Now remember, Laban is going in pursuit with just his men in a small group. They don't have all the sheep and the cattle and all the women and the kids and all the household goods. So they can travel a lot faster than Jacob and his huge entourage and family. And they're going to catch up with them in the hills of Gilead, which apparently is like 120 miles away. Again, I looked this stuff up. About 120 miles away from where Laban was living. So, that would mean if it was anyway, I'm not even going to attempt to do the math, but I did a little, my Bible has some great, scholarly work. A lot of the stuff that I'm reading actually comes in the Bible that I've got, which is really a really good Bible, because it's got scholarly footnotes and little articles that you can read, including interesting theological analysis. But mostly it's kind of scholarly stuff. It's kind of interesting, facts and figures, time and places, customs. I really like it. That's the same Bible that kicked off this whole project, actually. And I have to thank my uncle for that. He sent that to me. Thank you very much, Uncle. So I learned that in reading that little bit of scholarly stuff, that the math didn't work out. That even as fast as Jacob could have possibly gone with his family, there's no way they could have made it from where they were living with Laban to the hills of Galilee. So something's wrong in the math, and the scholarship recognizes that as well. And they're leaving that up to the future to figure it out. And they're saying that some of the estimates of time and distance may have been, again, to use that often word, metaphorical or more like emblematic. I'm not using the right word. It's like something that people of the time would have understood as being kind of symbolic, but not really literal. Hold on, I gotta see. Goodness, sorry. So let's just forget about the distance and the time. Let's just say that it was like he had a 3-day head start, and then like 6 days after that. So we're talking about 9 or 10. The other guy's working up there. 9 or 10 days later, they had Laban and his men had caught up with them in the hills of Galilee, and that is where they have a little bit of a confrontation. So the way the Bible, the New International describes it, Laban shows up. Jacob is there. He's already set up camp. Laban shows up, and he sets up camp too. So I can just imagine what that's like. They come. Maybe Jacob and his family have set up their, and we know that there's a tent for Leah. There's a tent for Rachel. There's a tent for their two slave girls. So they're all set up really nicely. The flock must be out there. Some people minding the flock, cooking. Some people cooking. Maybe some hunters out doing their thing. And so around the corner or over the hill, here comes Laban at last with his fighting men. They're all armed, and that must have been quite an upset at the camp of Jacob, right? Oh boy, here we go. Now he doesn't know that anyone has stolen the Laban's ancestor figures, the little gods, so to speak, gods in quotation marks, air quotes. He doesn't know that. That little deed was done by Rachel. Leah doesn't know, nobody knows, just Rachel. And so she did that for whatever reason. Bad idea. So they show up, and before any word is really spoken between Laban and Jacob, you get the impression that they show up, Laban's group shows up, and they stop, and they set up their camp. And so that's going to take like a whole afternoon at least, right? They get all the camp set up, and the fires are going, and they're starting to make dinner or something like that. And after a while, Laban moseys on over to Jacob. Now that must have been an interesting couple of hours for Jacob, right? As he's wondering what the heck. So Laban moseys on over, and here we go. It's time to talk. And first thing Laban says is, yo, no, he doesn't say that. He says, what were you thinking? Why did you leave the way you did? I didn't have a chance to kiss my daughters goodbye, or my grandchildren, or if you had only let me know that you were leaving, I would have sent you away with honors and with song and with singing and the timbrels and all the proper way to do it. But why did you choose to leave this way? And what about my gods? Why did you take my gods? My little statues. Now Jacob hears that, and he responds, I was kind of afraid that you might do me harm. And I didn't want that to happen. There's a lot of that in Abraham's line, a lot of fear of other men doing them harm, and willing to deceive or lie to escape that. But we won't hold that to God. But we've got to kind of wonder about God's chosen people that are so afraid that they seem to run and hide, including hiding behind the skirts of women, right? As did Abraham and Isaac. So okay, so there's two standing out there. Laban and Jacob are still standing out there. Laban complains, why did you leave? Jacob says, because I thought you were going to hurt me. And Laban then says, but you took everything. This is all mine. All these women that you married, they're my daughters. These children that they bore, these are my grandchildren. These cattle, these are all mine. And then now it's kind of back and forth. And Jacob then responds back and says, no, but I worked for these. I worked 20 years, 7 years each for your daughters, and then 6 years for the cattle. And you Laban, you changed my wages 10 times. And he complained about the 10 times to his wives out there in the field earlier as well. And now then, you can sense the tensions mounting, this back and forth. They're out there arguing. I imagine everybody's looking on. The men of Laban are standing there. They're probably armed, and the family of Jacob. I mean, they're probably not armed, maybe, or just lightly armed, and a lot of innocents and vulnerables, the women and the children. And what's going to happen? And Laban says, well, I could. It's within my power to do you harm. Now, what I haven't added though is that the night before, in the King James edition, they call it yesternight, a new word for me. Yesternight, well, Laban was sleeping. God, I'm assuming this is Yahweh, spoke to Laban, saying, "You better not lay a hand on my boy Jacob." He was kind of a very, very subtle, veiled threat. Do him no harm and no good. Basically said, do nothing to him. So I think Laban was kind of pushing it, even showing up, to confront Jacob, because God's threat was pretty, it was along the lines of, nice life you got here. You hate to see something happen to it, right? Very deep, yet also very subtle. And Laban now, relates that to Jacob. He says, and you can almost hear the frustration. It's like, gosh darn it, it's within my power. I could do you harm right here, but yesternight your God spoke to me and told me to not do anything. That's a wonder that Laban doesn't just convert it on the spot, right? And realize, wow, why don't I, if this powerful God is doing Jacob so good, well, why don't I instead of fighting it, why don't I get on the gravy train? And after all, I'm seed of Abraham too. right? I mean, he is, right? He's Jacob's uncle, after all. I mean, he's part of the chosen people. Clearly not the sharpest tack in the shed, so that's why the story doesn't follow Laban any further. I don't think. I don't remember if it does. So then okay, at that moment, then Jacob, realizing that he's okay, but sensing the frustration of Laban, he reaches over, and as he likes to do, he did this at Bethel. Remember the place where he slept and had the dream of the ladder to heaven, and he woke up and he was using a rock as a pillow, and he anointed it with oil and made a pillar there and called it Bethel, although it was called Bethel before, or another place called Bethel. Pretty sure it was the same place. It's like he was renaming the place, the name it already had, because his dad had done something similar at the same place. Or no, it was Abraham. His grandfather had done that. His grandfather had also set up an altar at Bethel. Remember? Twice. Oh boy. So anyway, so Jacob reaches over and says, "Oh, okay, hey, hold on." He grabs a big old rock, puts it down, and then Laban immediately gets where this is headed, and he grabs a rock and puts it on top of that, and then they kind of turn around to all the men and are gathered, or Laban does, and says, "Hey, you, okay, get some rocks, let's build a heap." That's what they called it, a heap. And they started heaping on stones, creating a little rock, well, maybe a big rock cairn there. And they have a little ceremony, and they actually start getting out the food, and they have dinner there. They cook up some dinner, and they have a little ceremony, and they may come to an agreement. They say that I won't cross over this, I, Jacob, won't cross past this rock heap to do you any harm, Laban, in your land. And Laban promises to do the same. I, Laban, won't cross over this rock heap to do you any harm in the land of your father either, Jacob. So they basically are set up a little boundary, and I think that's right there by close to the borders of modern day Syria. I did actually superimpose a modern map onto an ancient map. It kind of got a good idea. It's up there a little bit east of Aleppo, which a city in modern news these days, right, with the war in Syria. So it's right there by the border of Syria, to the eastern border of Syria, and at that point, that's it, I think, right? That's where it lets off. Well, we'll find out what happens next time. Was there anything I wanted to take from that? No, I think I covered everything. This is a very good chapter. Really enjoyed it. Again, more historical filler, but also it's got some interesting story content to it. And I learned a lot about some of the customs of ancient peoples, and also some of the geography. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a great day. Make it a good life, and see you next time. Bye.